if the U.S. commitment to free speech erodes further, that is likely to have significant consequences for free speech around the world, because the U.S. has been sort of the backbone of strong and robust free speech promotion and protections around the globe.
This is Atlas Network with Michael Carnuccio.
Welcome back to Atlas Network with Michael Carnuccio, where we bring you the most timely global conversations about individual liberty, limited government, and the worldwide freedom movement. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Jacob Mchangama, an international voice for free expression and the founder of the Future of Free Speech at Vanderbilt University. Jacob's work spans law, history, and policy, from his acclaimed book, Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media, to his work as a senior fellow with the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and to his involvement in our Smart Bets pitch competition this November at the Liberty Forum and Freedom Dinner in New York City. We're diving deep into the battle for free speech on both sides of the Atlantic and why his story should matter to every friend of freedom listening today. Jacob, thank you so much for being with us. We're honored to have you on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's start right at the top. What would you say is the most heightened or the most serious threat to free speech today, right now, currently?
I would say it's really a global free speech recession that has swept across the globe. And I think the most alarming tendency is that this is not only taking place in authoritarian countries where you're not exactly surprised that the Chinese Communist Party is using censorship, that Russia is doing it, Iran, and so on, but that the open democracies that used to be are supposed to be the stewards of free speech, that are the heartland, are also contributing to this free speech recession, and this includes America. Unfortunately, America, even though it has the strongest constitutional protection of free speech of any country in the world, free speech is very much contested in the US. And the culture of free speech that underpins that robust protection is eroding. And I think that if the US commitment to free speech erodes further, that is likely to have significant consequences for free speech around the world, because the US has been sort of the backbone of strong and robust free speech promotion and protections around the globe.
This is interesting because as I was thinking about our conversation, I was thinking about the idea of free speech zones on university campuses and just how absurd that kind of seems. And I wondered if I was going to ask you a question along the lines of what is underreported, right? What do we not know about that are threats to free speech? And then I wondered, is that actually it? Are we seeing it in the United States, or are there other major underreported threats that are happening around the world we don't know about?
So it's really across the board. If you look at the number of journalists imprisoned, it's right up there with the highest number on record for 20 years. If you see the number of countries where free speech is in retreat, it's also record numbers. In the US, the current administration has certainly put free speech under pressure. On his very first day in office, President Trump signed a very good executive order promising to restore free expression and respect the First Amendment. Unfortunately, a number of executive orders and other initiatives have cracked down on free speech. That is not unique, of course, to his administration. The Biden administration worked to sort of jawbone, i.e. put pressure on social media companies to remove content it didn't like behind the scenes. And it also put pressure on universities and so on. And then you have a situation, I think, within the US where political polarization means that people are very selective when it comes to free speech. So you had significant elements on the left who for a very long time said that, free speech is a conservative right-wing value that is being weaponized against minorities. We need to rein in the First Amendment so that it doesn't protect hate speech and disinformation. Now you see, and conservatives generally were sort of, oh no, we don't want the government to do that. Now, you have a Republican president and majority in Congress, and suddenly you hear the Attorney General talking about prohibiting hate speech, which would, is very surprising. And then suddenly you have liberals and progressives saying, no, hate speech, should definitely be protected by the First Amendment, even if they 5 minutes ago were adamant that hate speech is something that should be cracked down upon. And of course, that type of selective approach to free speech, where you only ever advance free speech when it advances your underlying ideological biases, that is corrosive to the principle of free speech, because power changes hands, right? This is something that the liberty movement, I feel, is understands better than anyone else.
You mentioned this earlier at the top of the conversation, where if we have norms change in liberal democracies such as the United States or most of Western Europe, that there's a drastic downstream effect. Can you help our audience understand what is that downstream effect? What should we be aware of?
Yeah, so let's. This is the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act. So the Helsinki Final Act was essentially the United States and Western Europe coming together, making this agreement with the communist states, so the Soviet bloc. And Western states smuggled sort of human rights language, free speech principles into those documents. And they played a really important role in empowering dissidents behind the Iron Curtain. Think of Václav Havel, people like that, who really used this language to call out their own governments for violating principles that they had signed up to. You had human rights organizations, free speech organizations in the West who could then help these dissidents, and you had politicians in Washington, in European capitals, using these principles to really call out these communist states. So that had that was a significant contributing factor in the collapse of communism, that a lot of dissidents behind the Iron Curtain really appreciated. You could see that when Václav Havel went to Congress shortly after becoming president in a free and democratic Czechoslovakia, as it was called at the time, and he gave this speech in Congress where he said, a few months ago I was arrested, I was in prison in a totalitarian regime. Now I stand before you as the president of a democratic country, a country with full freedom of speech. That was sort of the best case of how open democracies can use free speech as a powerful tool to advance freedom and democracy around the globe. Then you have specific cases like New York Times versus Sullivan, a 1964 Supreme Court case that set a very high bar for when you can bring defamation cases against, for instance, if you're a public official, then it's very, very hard to bring a defamation suit against a newspaper or even an ordinary citizen. That case, the actual malice standard that it set has actually been relied on by courts in countries like Argentina, in India, in a regional courts in West Africa, really in landmark cases that gave where First Amendment inspired principle helped protect journalists and others who had criticized powerful politicians or exposed corruption and so on. So that's a very strong, I think, example of American First Amendment jurisprudence being used by other countries to advance free speech.
So I'm fascinated here as we're talking further with this curiosity about your why. and why, with all of your success, all of your focus and energy, you decided to launch the freedom of free speech, the future of free speech, excuse me, and why you chose to do it at a university as well. I think that's interesting for our audience to learn about. Would you mind talking through that a little bit?
Yeah. So I had, I'm a lawyer by training. I worked in corporate law. Then I became director of legal affairs of a Danish think tank, sort of a classical liberal think tank. Then 11 years ago, I branched out, founded an independent think tank focusing solely on civil liberties. And then I found myself drawn more and more to free speech, and especially global aspects of free speech. And so in 2020, we launched the Future of Free Speech project. It was always the idea that we wanted to take it to the United States. And then when my book came out, the chancellor here at Vanderbilt University read it, and he invited me over to give a talk. And we found a very good solution going forward. We're an independent 501c3 institution, but we're located at Vanderbilt. We have a very good relationship with Vanderbilt, but we're independent. They have no sort of editorial rights over the work that we do. And so it's a win-win situation, but well, we can also tap into the world-class research community here at Vanderbilt. And I think the future of free speech is a little bit different from a number of other great organizations that work on free speech, in that we're more of a think tank. Then we don't do strategic litigation. We're not activists. You can think of us as sort of the ammunition factory for free speech. We come up with the logistics, the ammunition that we can then provide to those who fight in the trenches. And so I think that's a very good division of labor, where we can do sort of the heavy, deep research and, of course, also impactful advocacy. But we're not the ones who go to court. You have great organizations like FIRE who are really great at doing that in the United States. So that's really, I think, why we do this. And then we are also, I think, unique in the sense that we have a global mission. So we don't view free speech in isolation. We think that free speech is the most important freedom for any open, free, and flourishing society. It is the most fundamental freedom. Even if you care more about, if you care more about privacy or religious freedom or whatever, you really depend on free speech to advance your cause, right? That's one of the central points in my book. Today, unfortunately, in America, you see a lot of young people who argue that, we need to restrict free speech to protect minorities. But the great history of the First Amendment is that, free speech, the First Amendment, free expression, has to a large extent been won by unpopular and persecuted minorities who learned that free speech and equality are values that are mutually reinforcing. They are not mutually exclusive. And so that's also one of the things that is central to our work. And then we spend a lot of time now on the digital age, thinking about free speech and AI, in addition to work we've done on social media, because it's in the world that we live in, free speech is no longer confined to sort of just government and individual, because you have these private platforms that play an outsized role in being sort of the gatekeepers of the practical exercise of free speech of millions of people around the world.
So one of the parts I love about getting to host this program and have conversations with peers of ours throughout the worldwide freedom movement is the background of everyone that kind of shapes how they come at the work that they do. And, if someone was an entrepreneur or a business person, or if someone was just kind of research and deep into a specific area of public policy, it's interesting to hear about that. So I'm fascinated by your legal background and wondering about how that maybe shapes your approach to public opinion and policy that you all work on now?
Yeah, so I mean, lawyers can be very useful when it comes to free speech, but I also think we have limits. So one of the things that I really want us to do, and that I stress a lot, is that it's incredibly important to have an interdisciplinary approach. Lawyers have, like I said, we have useful skills, but they're also limited skill set. So if you try to understand everything through a legalistic lens, you're going to miss out on the bigger picture. You're not going to be as impactful. So in order to do, serious research on free expression in today's world, you need political scientists, you need, computer scientists, you need historians, and all of that, I think, is necessary for things to come together. But I don't think it was my legal background that really sparked my interest in free speech. So I think there are a couple of factors. One, I was born and raised in Denmark, and 20 years ago, a Danish newspaper published a number of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, and that up until then, I'd taken free speech for granted. Denmark is this, very safe haven for secular liberal values, where speaking freely was as natural as breathing the air. And I essentially thought of free speech as a freedom that had been won. I certainly never imagined that it would come under pressure from religious extremists, but that turned out to be the case. Denmark became sort of the epicenter of a global battle of values over the relationship between free speech and religion. And to my surprise and dismay, I saw a lot of people who had for a long time taken it for granted that you could, criticize Christianity, suddenly saying, well, free speech should not be abused to punch down on a vulnerable minority, in this case, meaning Muslims and Islam, which to me was a very surprising argument, especially if you take serious the idea that everyone is equal before the law. Then no religious believer should have more or fewer rights than anyone else. And criticism of religion obviously has been a very important driver of freedom more broadly, and that is not only for atheists and agnostics. It's vital for devout religious believers to be able to criticize religious doctrines that they disagree with without being persecuted by the Orthodox. So that's really what set me down the rabbit hole of free speech, from which I've never been able to escape ever since.
We love partnerships at Atlas Network, and you already mentioned here in our conversations FIRE and the work that you all have done together. What does that look like? What is that collaboration? What work have you seen in them? And talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I've been a senior fellow with FIRE for a number of years. FIRE was sponsored my podcast on the history of free speech that led into the book on the history of free speech. So they've been instrumental in sort of my development. They've helped us a lot in sort of establishing our footprint in the U.S. We recently, last week, we held our annual Global Free Speech Summit, and FIRE was one of our sponsors. And I think that FIRE has done a great work. I was really pleased to see them sort of expanding from being solely focused on campus issues to embracing the First Amendment more fully. And I think they're doing stellar work in that sense. And I love the fact that organizations that work in the same space collaborate, partner up, rather than see each other as competition. You want to get to that win-win where you combine each other's strengths in pursuit of the greater good. And I don't think there's a greater good than free expression.
So you've mentioned the book a couple of times. Let's talk about it, right? It's Free Speech, a history from Socrates to social media, right? And so you also talked about doing the podcast kind of leading into the book. So I wonder, after having done the podcast and everything else, and then going into writing the book, was there something that surprised you the most about writing the book, or what came out of that exercise?
I mean, when you research a book on the global history of free speech, there's a lot of material to go through. And yeah, it was interesting to sort of see the many global manifestations of free speech. That free speech is not solely sort of a Western value. Early proto free thinkers can be found in medieval Islam, for instance, was something that I was not aware of. You see, elements of religious tolerance in Mughal India, and so on. Then there are some things that you might have seen instances of it, but you didn't realize how prevalent this was. It's one of the things is what I call Milton's curse. So John Milton obviously is this famous English poet who wrote the Areopagitica, a famous, eloquent treatise against pre-publication censorship and in favor of press freedom. And many of the arguments in it are timeless and worth repeating. But it's also true that when you read it more closely, John Milton is not in favor of press freedom for Catholics, for radicals. He's against sedition. He's in favor of blasphemy laws, and he ends up serving as a censor under Cromwell. And so this is unfortunately a very recurrent theme throughout the history of free speech, that people who favor it have their limits, and so that's why I called it Milton's curse. Another recurrent theme is what I call elite panic. So this tendency that whenever the public sphere is expanded through new communications technology or new previously marginalized voices being given an access to the public sphere, the traditional institutional gatekeepers tend to think that this is corrosive to the social cohesion of society, whether that's in America, allowing abolitionists to spread their ideas into the South, or women getting the vote, or if you go back in time, the spread of the printing press, and in our day and age, elite panic about mis and disinformation in the digital age, and that very often leads to quite censorial policies by the institutional gatekeepers. And that, ironically, today includes, to a certain extent, traditional media who, used to be the ones who disrupted traditional gatekeepers with the printing press. But now that they, had become gatekeepers themselves, they're less enthusiastic about extending a voice to ordinary people.
Is there one central theme? Well, I was going to ask you about a central theme to the book, but I wonder, maybe more importantly, is there one point, if you distilled everything down to kind of one point a reader can take away from the book that's most applicable to that current situation and threat to free speech that we talked about at the beginning of the program? What would that one point comment be?
Yeah, I think it's elite panic, at least if you look at the US and the West, that for a very long time, sort of traditional elite institutions have been hesitant about free speech. They view it increasingly as sort of a Trojan horse or a double-edged sword, that rather than sort of an unalloyed good. If you more broadly, I would just say that in the book I talk about what I call free speech entropy, sort of this continuous, whenever free speech is won, it's never won for good. There's always these forces that pull at free speech, and that's why free speech is never fully won or lost. It's a continuing process, and that's why you can never take free speech for granted, and that's a central point in the future of free speech. It's a central point in the smart bets pitch, that we're at a critical moment in time where we can't just say, well, we have these great principles on paper and constitutions. No, free speech entropy is real. There are and will always be forces who try to undermine, erode this principle. And the current moment we're living in, those forces are in the ascendancy. And there's nothing natural about free speech. You know, in the liberty movement, we might call it a natural right, but natural rights need infrastructure, culture, norms to support them. Otherwise, those who don't agree with them will ultimately win. And I think a world without free speech is likely to be a lot less free, a lot less prosperous, a lot less flourishing, and frankly, a lot less fun.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Let's talk about smart bets. You brought it up. I was excited to talk about it today. Give us a glimpse for those of us that are going to be in New York. What are we going to hear? What's the central theme of the pitch?
So the central theme of the pitch goes back to some of the things we already discussed, that free speech in the United States is under pressure. And so we want to reinforce the bulwark of liberty, as it was called in the 18th century, this meme that went viral in the colonies. So ensuring that the prohibition on viewpoint discrimination is upheld, New York Times versus Sullivan, and Section 230 that essentially is the cornerstone of internet freedom. But we don't want to look at it solely from a U.S. point of view. As I mentioned, the U.S. has been central to the expansion of free speech and democracy throughout the second half of the 20th century and into the early 21st century. And so we also want to take those principles in what we call three democratic or free speech swing states. So that's Brazil, India, and South Africa. So if we can have an impact in America, but also these three swing states, then we can have an outsized impact on the future of free speech globally. You know, Brazil being the largest democracy in Latin America, South Africa, the most important democracy in Africa, and India, the largest democracy in the world. But in all of those countries, free speech is now in retreat, being contested, and some of the central principles of American free speech law and norms would be central to buttressing free speech in those countries. So that is essentially what we're trying to do. Focusing on these four countries, I think will have is likely to have a huge global impact in really, really significant countries. Because right now, unfortunately, it is countries that are not open liberal democracies that are increasingly setting the agenda and eroding free speech norms.
So not just for the work and the impact as you described, but I wonder about for you and your colleagues with the organization, what would winning smart bets mean for you all?
First of all, it's always an honor to be at the Liberty Forum, and one of the things that I enjoy about being in New York at the Liberty Forum is that you meet with people who really understand the value of free speech, even if they're more concerned in their day-to-day lives about tax reform or education reform. You know, that group of people in that room really get free speech in a way, in a very principled way that you don't get in a lot of other places. So that's inspiring in and of itself. But you know, if we do manage to win, then that will be a huge proof of concept for this project, and of course will help us convince other donors to contribute to what is admittedly a quite ambitious project, but one that I think is absolutely necessary right now.
I'm interested in your thoughts. We're having this conversation not too long after the Nobel Prize was announced and awarded to a colleague of ours in the worldwide freedom movement out of Venezuela, of course, Maria Machado receiving that recognition. What importance does that play, whether it be historically or just in the moment right now in this conversation with respect to free speech?
I think that's hugely important. Venezuela is actually a very good case of a country where that repeats sort of an iron law of history, in that whenever you want to create an autocracy, the very first lesson for any would-be dictator is to control speech. And so you see from Chavez until Maduro in Venezuela, there's been constant encroachment on free speech and more and more heavy-handed censorship. And what you've seen, especially under Maduro, is that they have cleverly been using the language of hate speech and international human rights to legitimize crackdowns on free speech. And that's exactly one of the things that our project would try to counter by building more robust free speech norms. So I think that recognizing the struggle of the Venezuelan opposition, or the legitimate democratically elected leaders, if you like, is important and is very clearly tied into the importance of free speech and the consequences of denying it, because free speech is also the antithesis of violence, right? It's the best way that human beings have discovered to settle our differences peacefully. When you combine it with democracy and limited government, we don't have to agree on everything. We make certain compromises, but we're able to discuss everything. And I can, if I live under a government that I think does not represent me well, that chooses policies that I think are going in the wrong direction, free speech allows me to express my criticism. It allows me to organize opposition, to come up with better ideas, to petition the government, to create a new political party, if that's what I want.
I'm wondering, some are saying now, look, too much free speech, we expand freedom of expression, or we're too loose with it. And this is where you get disinformation, right? This is where you create this environment. And so that's probably the biggest criticism today. We're hearing quite a bit. What do you say to that?
Yeah, but I mean, obviously, allowing lots of voices to speak freely will result in misinformation and ideas that are less sound than others being put out there. But I ultimately think that is a good. There's a lot of ideas that were once believed to be very good and sound that have been discarded. Why have they been discarded? Well, because people have been able to test them, to criticize them, come up with new and better ideas. And then just from a purely, when you think about the nature of power, who do you trust to define what is mis and disinformation, right? If you had the power to define that, would you be guided unscrupulously by the best available evidence, or would you be tempted, to use it like the ring of power in the Lord of the Rings? Would you turn into Sauron? I think that's probably a more likely scenario, and so that's why I think that's why it's actually quite concerning, because I think one really sharp dividing line between open democracies and authoritarian states used to be that open democracies did not criminalize false information. That really was, it's a tactic of the Soviet blocs where you had the capital T truth. It's also what you see in religiously authoritarian states. You have one capital T truth, which is religious orthodoxy. Free societies are built on something very different, right? The government doesn't have a monopoly on truth. It derives its powers from the people, and therefore the people must have every right to reject whatever line the government is trotting out, even if the government thinks that the people are spreading ideas that it thinks it undermines its power. Well, it doesn't. Its power rests on the people. So if the people have different ideas than the government, well, tough luck for the government. And free speech is messy. It's imperfect. Sometimes it can lead to real life harms. But if you look at the history of free speech, I think it's quite clear that it is a much better alternative to sort of top-down centralized imposition of truth and opinion, to have this messy principle. And we tend, sometimes human beings tend to sort of have a negativity bias. So we see all the noise and sound and fury that comes out of free speech, and we take all the benefits of free speech for granted. But once that principle is taken away, you'll wake up and you'll suddenly realize all of the good things that flows from free speech when it's suddenly being denied. And you can ask the people of Venezuela about that because they know.
That's another good point. Folks, we're having a conversation today with Jacob Mchangama from the Future of Free Speech. If you'd like to learn more about his work, his book, and the work that he and his colleagues are doing, go to atlasnetwork.org. While you're there, go ahead and become a member of the Atlas Club, along with my wife and I, or with a $25 contribution, you'll get a copy of Freedom's Champion magazine. And Jacob, if we could, I'd love to jump on that point right there, just about your interaction and involvement with Atlas Network. What has that been like, and what has that meant to you and your study and your work toward free speech?
Yeah, like I said, it's always inspiring to be in New York, but also we have worked with several partner organizations. So we're working now with, we have another project where we're looking at foreign agent and extremism laws that are being sort of drafted in Russia and then China, and then being sort of exported to other countries, affecting a number of Atlas organizations, actually. And so it's essential for us to be able to do work on that, to partner with Atlas Network partners. So some of the work that we do is explicitly, directly inspired by meetings we've had with Atlas Network partners. And then, the support from Atlas Network is sort of sharpening our mission and vision as we started out. Really, really valuable to have those conversations. So yeah, I think it's been really valuable for us, and it's sort of a partnership where it's not just one benefit that sort of helps you get the ball rolling. It's something that you can tap into and that strengthens your organization on an ongoing basis, and that I think is quite unique.
You mentioned support. I wonder if there's a donor watching right now that wonders if philanthropy can really move the needle in the free speech conversation, or maybe the other side, from a positive standpoint. There's someone that's thinking about, how can I contribute, or will my philanthropy make a difference in this? What would you say to them?
Yeah, we've you can go to our website, look what we've done. I think we've had a real tangible impact, in various countries, and also when it comes to, for instance, how social media companies have changed their policies right now. We're having an impact on how AI companies are thinking about their free speech policies. And we're a small team, but I think we punch well above our weight. And I think one of the secrets of our success is also that we're staunchly nonpartisan, and we, will criticize anyone, regardless of party affiliation, if they undermine free speech. But we'll also work with anyone who will advance it, and I think that's unfortunately quite rare these days, where a lot of organizations tend to have a certain ideological or partisan bias. We don't do that. We have a laser focus on advancing the principle of free speech and nothing else. There's no hidden agendas. So I think if you have that clear mission and vision as we do, that just means that you can rest assured that your hard-earned dollars actually go to supporting the core mission of our work.
So, Jacob, we've come to the point of the program where I love to dive a little bit deeper into just who you are and your experience, right? And so the way we typically do this with a guest on the pod is I'm going to ask you, if we were having this conversation in your hometown, right? So you mentioned Denmark a couple times. Let's go back there. And we were going to go afterwards and have a meal together, right? What are we eating? What is the thing that I've got to have when I'm in your neck of the woods back in Denmark?
Oh, yeah, that's good, because I haven't lived in Copenhagen for almost 3 years. But the food scene in Copenhagen is amazing. There's all, but it's not traditional Danish food. I'd say, if you go back 20 or 30 years, you'd probably be quite disappointed. I myself am quite partial to Asian food, so I'd probably go to a good Asian restaurant. Though I just came back from Cartagena in Colombia, and I have to say, very rarely have I been at a place where you have as high a concentration of just great food as in Cartagena. That's not my hometown, but maybe I would try and find a place with good Caribbean food. I don't know if they have that in Denmark. Yeah.
Well, what about you're on the campus of Vanderbilt now, and so is there some spot around there? If anybody comes to Vanderbilt, they gotta eat somewhere or do something?
So I live out in Franklin, which is like 40 minutes south of Nashville. So I would probably go to Fox and Lock in Leaper's Fork on a Thursday, where they have live music. You have all these bands coming up and performing, 2 songs, and it's a great atmosphere in this really small, idyllic little town. And then once you've eaten your southern food and listen to music, you go across the street to the Tornado Room, which is like a small speakeasy, and the atmosphere is great. And that's a good night out.
Okay, Jacob, you're obviously well-read and you're following free speech and issues all across the globe. But what about when you're not? What are some hobbies? What are you doing when you're outside of the office?
I'm assimilating, right? I live in the United States in a subdivision in a cul-de-sac where we've created our own pickleball court, and I also religiously follow the Arsenal, a soccer team from London, with my son. So we get up sometimes at 6:30 a.m. to watch to watch games. And then reading is high on my list. So I try to read right now. Reading Thomas Sowell, which is a good read. It tends to be a lot of history very often. As I said, I just came back from Cartagena, Colombia, just bought a huge brick of a book about Simon Bolivar to sort of check out the history of that region.
Okay, last question for you today, Jacob, and it's one that this whole conversation I've been itching to ask, but I wanted to save it here for the end. We obviously started the program today talking about threats, underreported threats, concerns that you have, but I can hear in your voice a bit of hope, some enthusiasm. So, what gives you hope for the future of free speech?
Very often progress on free speech has followed sort of setbacks where people suddenly realize, whoa, we actually stand to lose a lot. And American history is a great example of that. You had the Red Scares, you had crackdowns on the civil rights movement, and so on. You had 7 years after the ratification of the First Amendment, you had the Alien Sedition Act, where you go to prison if you criticized President John Adams, and the response to that was a rejection by the American people who voted Thomas Jefferson into office, and he let the Sedition Act lapse. So I think there's a ton of reasons for optimism, and I think that hopefully in 5-10 years we'll be in a better space than we are now. But again, free speech is never truly won or lost. It's an ongoing struggle, also because just as human beings, we're flawed and imperfect, and sometimes free speech can be a very difficult principle for us to live up to, even if we appreciate it in the abstract.
Well, Jacob, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for all the great work you're doing. I can't wait to see you in New York and continue this conversation. And I want to encourage all of our listeners and anyone viewing this program to join us in New York at the Liberty Forum and Freedom Dinner. You can get information about that event by going to atlasnetwork.org. And while you're there, you can follow Jacob and his colleagues at the Future of Free Speech and get more information about them. Again, Jacob, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a privilege.
And folks, it's been a privilege to join you and have this conversation. Anywhere that you get a podcast, whether it be YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or atlasnetwork.org, you can follow this podcast and conversations with Jacob and his peers from throughout the worldwide freedom movement with Atlas Network with Michael Carnuccio. Until next time, stay free.